Hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Introduction to Cultural Studies, where we're looking at Michel Foucault's essay, What is an Author? We have already had 3 lectures in this particular text, and we'll just continue with the text in this lecture as well. So in the last lecture, we talked about how Foucault examines the discursive markers of the author function, and it talks about the different kinds of author functions. He historicizes the different author functions. For instance, he talks about how the author functions were different when it came to scientific texts and literary texts in the ancient and Middle Ages, where scientific texts needed to have an author function. They needed an individual author to mark the veracity, to authenticate the veracity in the Middle Ages, where literary texts like the epics and the oral narratives do not require any oral function at all. Any author function at all, sorry. They just require a degree of ancientness, a degree of sacrality, which is sufficient to give them an acknowledgeable quality in the Middle and Ancient times, classical times. But he also examines how the entire thing got reversed in 17th and 18th centuries with the rise of the printing press, where the literary text began to require a very prominent author function, a marker, an individual marker authenticating the content, whereas the scientific text just needed to be located, just needed to be situated in a particular discursive field, in an ensemble of discursive fields in order to pass off or in order to be acknowledged as scientific texts. Right? So that becomes a very dramatic reversal, as it were. And then he talked about, in the last lecture we saw towards the end, how he talked about the different kinds of author functions. For instance, the author function which will be operative for a philosophy author or a philosophy writer would be quite different from the author function of a literary writer. Okay, and he had talked about also the legality of the literary writer, how things such as copyright, royalty, these become very important issues, and how authorship, or the idea of authority, is quite enmeshed or entangled with economic and political and legal discourses, and how the author function becomes a discursive marker which could be transgressive, and if it becomes transgressive, the author can be held accountable for the content which is transgressive, and hence he can be penalized or punished because of that. Okay, so we talked about how different literary works where, again, were traced back to the author, the content of the literary works which are offensive in quality were traced back to the author, and how the author was attacked. Sometimes, the body of the author was attacked. For instance, a classic case in point would be Taslima Nasreen Salman, which and you can think of many other authors in recent times who were held accountable for the controversial content of their works. Okay, so and we just continue with this particular essay in this particular lecture, and where Foucault is looking at literary criticism and how literary criticism becomes a very important tool which helps us examine the discursive quality of the marker of the author function. Okay, so this should be on your screen as Foucault goes on to sort of examine. And I quote him, "It seems, for example, that the manner in which literary criticism once defined the author, or rather constructed the figure of the author beginning with existing texts and discourses, is directly derived from the manner in which Christian tradition authenticated or rejected the text at its disposal." So he's looking at a very interesting structural and functional similarity between the ancient Christian principle of acknowledging certain texts as religious texts and rejecting certain other texts as non-religious texts, and how a similar principle is in operation when it comes to the author function today. So he goes on to give an example how. In order to rediscover the work of an author in a work, modern criticism uses methods similar to those of Christian exegesis, employed when trying to prove the value of a text by its author's saintliness. Okay, so again, there's a very interesting return of sacrality over here, which becomes very interesting and paradoxically interesting as well when it comes to the very secular, so-called secular industry of authorship. There too, the saintliness of the author, or the purity of the author's presence, becomes very important. Now, obviously, we're not talking about saintliness or purity in religious terms. We're talking about purity in terms of clarity. So there needs to be a very clear location, a very clear marker of the author in the modern author industry, in the modern publishing industry, right? So there needs to be no vagueness at all when it comes to the identity of the author. So in that sense, the author becomes a very pure presence, so we know exactly who the author is. So there's a very structural similarity between this kind of identity production or identity marking and the kind of marking which happened in Christian, so the entire Christian politics of authorship of certain religious and sacred texts. So he gives an example, Foucault over here. In De Viris Mistribus, Saint Jerome explains that homonymy is not sufficient to identify legitimately authors of more than one work. Different individuals could have had the same name, or one man could have illegitimately borrowed another's patronymic. The name of the individual trademark is not enough when one works within a textual tradition. So, he talks about how the text could be seen as carrying markers of a particular author's identity. So even if the identity of the author is not there or is unclear, the text could be seen, the text could be read in a way that will reveal the identity of the author through certain idiosyncratic phrases, through certain idiosyncratic markers, through certain ticks, etc. Right? So again, we're looking at a textual strategy of rediscovering the author. Right? So the entire idea of reading a text is sort of invested towards discovering the author if the author happens to be absent, or if the author happens to be unclear, or the author function happens to be unclear at any given point of time. Okay, so how then can one attribute several discourses to one and the same author? How can one use the author function to determine if one is dealing with one or several individuals? Saint Jerome proposes 4 criteria. 1. If among several books attributed to an author, one is inferior to the others, it must be withdrawn from the list of author's works. The author is therefore defined as a constant level of value. So the first level, the first marker is a marker of value. So if you have, for instance, if there's a controversy about the author's production, suppose you have like 10 books of a particular author, and we're unclear whether or not those 10 books were authored by the same author, by the same person. So what do? The first marker, the Saint Jerome proposes away, is a marker of value. So you find out which particular book is of inferior value compared to the others, and you withdraw that. You reject it as belonging to the author, right? So it doesn't belong to the author because it falls within a particular permissible standard when it comes to that particular author. So that's the first marker, is a marker of value. Number 1. Number 2, the same should be done if certain texts contradict the doctrine expounded by in the author's other works. The author is thus defined as a field of conceptual or theoretical coherence. So this is a very interesting concept over here. The author could also be seen as a field of theoretical or conceptual coherence. So there should be some coherence in the author's over, right, in the author's works. If you have one work or more than one work which completely contradicts the concept of the author, the conceptual coherence of the author, the conceptual field of the author, which is otherwise present across all the other texts, you can also mark the particular text as not belonging to the author. So the first marker is value, the second marker is conceptual coherence. And these are the markers that Foucault is examining as defined by Saint Jerome. And we can see how, obviously, Saint Jerome is talking about Christian texts over here, written by Christian saints, and how the same kind of an exegesis could be used when it comes to modern secular literary authorship, as Foucault is examining over here. So there's a structural parallel that Foucault is examining between Christian authorship, Christian idea of text, and more secular industrial idea of text in a modern publishing world. So first is value, second, coherence. Third, one must also exclude works that are written on a different style. So again, consistency in style becomes a marker of an author function. So if you have a text written which is completely different from the style of a particular author, and if you don't know, if you're unclear about the authorship of the particular text, then we can safely exclude it from a particular author if it doesn't conform to the dominant style which runs across the other texts written by that particular author. Okay, so containing words and expressions not ordinarily found in a writer's production. The author is here conceived as a stylistic unity. Fourthly, finally, passages quoting statements made or mentioning events of concern that occurred after the author's death must be regarded as interpolated text. The author is here seen as a historical figure at the crossroads of a certain number of events. So the final value, the final criterion is historical in quality. So if you find, according to Saint Jerome, if you find references to events, references to incidents and activities which happened historically after the death of the author, then we can safely disregard that particular text as an interpolated text, or that section as an interpolated section which the author did not write, or the author did not create or compose. Okay, so these are 4 criteria that Saint Jerome points. And now what we see running across all the 4 criteria is the concept of unity. So there is a sense of unity that comes to the idea of authorship, right? So that is being sought after, that's the destination that is being chased by readership. So, a unity in style, a unity in conceptual coherence, a unity in terms of value, quality, and lastly a unity in terms of historical narrative, right? So all the functions come together and point towards one major theme that runs across all the 4 different conditions laid out by Saint Jerome, and that is the condition of unity and homogeneity. So the author function becomes it's sort of a closure function to a certain extent. You can argue that when you know the author, we have a sense of closure. We know exactly the style, we know exactly the historical period, we know exactly the conceptual coherence, etc., the value, etc. So all these things come together and give you and construct the field of the author, which is a closed field, the closure construct. So the author becomes a closure construct according to these kinds of arguments, and it's exactly what modern secular publishing industry seeks to have, a closure construct when it comes to an author, right? So it should not be too transgressive in the way, in the sense that we don't know who the author is. That becomes a problem when it comes to the very economically overdetermined, legally overdetermined modern politics of authorship. So we need to have an identifiable author, an identifiable marker, a set of markers, identifiable markers which correspond to the presence of the author. Okay. And now Foucault is looking at how these criteria, the 4 criteria that Saint Jerome talked about as conditions of Christian authorship, how these are perfectly applicable when it comes to modern secular authorship or literary criticism as we know it today, as Foucault examines it in his times. Modern literary criticism, and I read out Foucault over here, modern literary criticism, even when, as is now customary, is not concerned with questions of authentication, still defines the author in much the same way. So there is a structural similarity that needs to be unpacked between modern literary criticism and older Christian tradition of ascribing authorship on certain texts. The author provides the basis for explaining not only the presence of certain events in a work, but also their transformations, distortions, and diverse modifications through his biography, the determination of his individual perspective, the analysis of his social position, and the revelation of his basic design. So again, design, motivation, perspective, point of view, personal point of view, social position, these become markers of a certain kind of work, and we can trace it back to a certain individual. So again, what we're looking at is a closure. So author becomes a closure function when it comes to looking at text. So we can reduce the text, we can look at a text and map it into an author, which then becomes a very convenient kind of a causal relationship, which fits in perfectly to the industry of authorship that we have today. So the author is also the principle of a certain unity of writing. All differences have to be resolved, at least in part, by the principles of evolution, maturation, or influence. So again, all the differences, all the seeming differences, contradictions of the text can be resolved if we evoke the author function in a particular way, in a very functional way. Okay? The author also serves to neutralize the contradictions that may emerge in a series of texts. So the author becomes a very utility function to neutralize, to cohere, to conform, to close, to level away differences. So the author becomes a very convenient construct, and especially in modern industry of authorship, modern publication industry, etc. So again, Foucault gives a very radical sort of retelling of a certain Christian authorship at work in modern times. So there must be, at a certain level of his thought or desire, of his consciousness or unconscious, a point where contradictions are resolved, where incompatible elements are at last tied together or organized around a fundamental originating contradiction, right? So all contradictions can be traced back to an origin, right, to a particular point of inception, and that point of inception, that point of origin is the author. So we can see how by this time we should be able to recognize the author as a very convenient construct which is used to level away and address contradictions, account for contradictions, account for conformity and non-conformity. So the author becomes an accountable function, right, a closure function. So all these functions come together very conveniently in the construct of the author. Finally, the author is a particular source of expression that, in more or less completed forms, is manifested equally well and with similar validity in works, sketches, letters, fragments, and so on. Clearly, St. Jerome's 4 criteria of authenticity, a criteria that seem totally insufficient for today's exegetes, do define the 4 modalities according to which modern criticism begins the author function into play, or brings the author function into play. So paradoxically, we have a return of the religious over here, a return of the sacred over here. So we're looking for a absolute function we're looking for a closure. Obviously, absolute function becomes a closure by default. The author becomes the absolute unity, the umbrella term for a certain over of work, through which all contradictions, all inconsistencies, all fractures, all discontinuities can be accounted for. That umbrella term, which is the author. Okay, so there is a very interesting similarity or commonality that Foucault examines, and this is brilliant, really, if you look at it carefully, between the old Christian tradition of ascribing authorship to texts and modern secular industry of authorship that we have or experience today. Okay, but the author function is not a pure and simple reconstruction made secondhand from a text given as inert material. The text always contains a certain number of signs referring to the author. So again, the text contains certain revelatory signs which expose the author, which point towards the author in a way. These signs, well known to grammarians and personal pronouns, adverbs of time and space, time and place, and verb conjunction or conjugation. Such elements do not play in the same role in discourses provided with the author function as in those lacking it. In the latter, such shifters refer to the real speaker and to the spatio-temporal coordinates of his discourse, although certain modifications can occur, as in the operation of relating discourses in the first person. In the former, however, the role is more complex and variable. Everyone knows that. In a novel offered as a narrator's account, neither the first-person pronoun nor the present indicative refers exactly to the writer or to the moment in which he writes, but rather to an alter ego whose distance from the author varies, often changing in the course of the work. So, we're looking at this very modern or postmodern difference between the author and the narrator, right? So, we know today, for instance, in any sophisticated literary criticism, the idea of the narrator becomes more important. It's oftentimes distance from the author. So we have the narrator, the I, the speaking voice becomes a character, sometimes unreliable, sometimes deliberately unreliable, as in postmodern literature. But that distance between the author and the narrator keeps changing all the time. That's something that Foucault is examining over here. It would be just as wrong to equate the author with the real writer as to equate him with a fictitious speaker. The author function is carried out and operates in the schism itself, in this division and this distance. So the author function is actually carried out through this division, through this schism, the fracture between the narrator and the author. So the fracture itself contains the author function to a great extent. The distance between the narrator and the author, that distance itself contains the discursive author function in modern and postmodern literature, as Foucault examines it. So he's actually problematizing this very neat idea of the author as a narrator. So he says there's a distance to be made between the narrator and the author. Sometimes in postmodern literature, the distance is explicitly dramatized and played out. However, despite the distance, we still have the gap itself becomes the bearer or the marker of the author function in modern and postmodern literature. Okay. And then he goes on to say, one might object that this is a characteristic peculiar to novelistic or poetic discourse, a game in which only quasi-discourses participate. In fact, however, all discourses endowed with the author function possess the plurality of self. So there's a plurality of self, a plural self, a certain sense of plurality which is invested in the author function as Foucault examines it. The self that speaks in the preface to a treatise on mathematics, and that indicates the circumstances of the treatise's composition identical neither in its position nor in its functioning to self, speaks in the course of a demonstration, and that appears in the form of an I conclude or I suppose. In the first case, the I refers to an individual without an equivalent who, in a determined place and time, completed a certain task. In the second, the I indicates an instance and a level of demonstration which any individual could perform, provided that he accepted the same system of symbols, play of axioms, and a set of previous demonstrations. Okay, so there are two kinds of I over here that Foucault is dramatizing. The first I is an instance, right? The first I is an individual, as someone who, in a determined place and time, completed a certain task. That's a pure author function. The first I is someone who carried out the task, completed the task, the particular individual, etc. The second I is the phenomenon, where any individual can perform that particular task, given that, provided that that particular individual stays in a discursive field. So the first I is an individual, the second I is an activity, and that's something that's very clearly mapped out by Foucault over here. So I conclude or I suppose. So, so it talks about different kinds of I's, different kinds of authorship functions in modern texts. So one I is obviously the individual, the originator, the creator, the source, etc. The other I could also be the player, the executor, someone who carries out the discursive function in that discursive field, if situated in the same discursive field. Okay. We could also, in the same treatise, locate a third self. So he complicates it further. He said that there could be a possible third self, one that speaks to tell the work's meaning, the obstacles encountered, the results obtained, and the remaining problems. This self is situated in a field of already existing or yet to appear mathematical discourses. So we have a third self that could talk about the obstacles encountered, the possibilities that can go from further, the meaning of the work, etc. And this particular self can be situated in the already existing or yet to appear mathematical discourses. So he's talking about mathematical discourse over here. He's talking about the author in the mathematical discourse. So, the third kind of a self could be, the third I could be that I which is located between what is possible and what, has already happened. So a liminal kind of an I is being talked about over here. The author function is not assumed by the first of these selves at the expense of the other two, which would then be nothing more than a fictitious splitting in two of the first one. On the contrary, in these discourses, the author function operates so as to affect the dispersion of these three simultaneous selves. And this is a very, very postmodern definition of the author. So he talks about the entanglement. Again, this is a word I keep throwing at you, but I hope this is useful. A very asymmetric entanglement of three different kinds of selves which are invested in the idea of authorship. So the first self is the individual, the originator, the person who makes a theorem, the person who writes, the person who articulates. First, second, the second self, the second I, is the person who plays out the particular theorem, the particular theory, the particular set of coordinates in a particular discursive field. The player, the executor, the one who carries out the function. The third I is situated between what is possible and what has already happened, right? The liminal I, the moving I between the possibility and reality. And Foucault says over here that the true author function, the complex author function, is and emerges from an entanglement of these three different kinds of I's: the individual, the player, and the liminal presence. Okay, so these three come together in terms of looking at the proper complex author function in mathematics as you see it today. Okay, a degree of simultaneity is in operation over here. Okay, so no doubt analysis could discover still more characteristic traits of the author function. I will limit myself to these four, however, because they seem both the most visible and the most important. They can be summarized as follows. So what are the traits of author function? And again, Foucault gives you four traits of author functions. And what are those? First, the author function is linked to the juridical and institutional system that encompasses, determines, and articulates the universe of discourses. So the very juridical, institutional system that determines discourses, the universe of discourses. So that is the first author function. A very legal, juridical, institutional kind of signifier. That is the first author function. Second, it does not affect all discourses in the same way at all times and in all types of civilization. So it's a very variable function. It's not an absolute function at all. It doesn't affect all discourses in the same way and in the same types of historical periods. So it depends on the type of civilization. It depends on type of discourse, etc. So it's a very complex, variable function. That's trait number two. Trait number three, it is not defined by the spontaneous attribution of a discourse to its producer, but rather by a series of specific and complex operations. So it doesn't depend on a particular spontaneous outburst of a discourse. It's not linear in its quality. It's not monodiscursive in quality. It's rather multidiscursive in quality. That's another function of the author. It takes up different complex operations, right? So it's not really a monolingual, monolithic author function that we're talking about over here. It's a very complex cognitive function which takes in a heteroglossia of meanings, a heteroglossia of coordinates, a heteroglossia of discursive possibilities. Fourthly, it does not refer purely and simply to a real individual, since it can give rise to simultaneously several selves, to several subjects, positions that can be occupied by different classes of individuals, right? So it can transcend the reductionism of an individual. It can become more than just one individual. It can become one person divided into many selves. And we just saw a good example a while ago, the producer, the someone who carries out the player, the producer, the player, and the liminal presence. All three selves can be simultaneously present or invested in the author function. Okay, so up to this point, I have unjustifiably limited my subject. Certainly, the author function is in painting, music, and other arts should have been discussed. But even supposing that we remain within a world of discourse, as I wanted to do, I seem to have given the term author much too narrow a meaning. I have discussed the author only in the limited sense of a person to whom the production of a text, a book, or a work can be legitimately attributed. It is easy to see that in the sphere of discourses, one can be the author of much more than just a book. One can be the author of a theory, tradition, or discipline in which other books and authors will in their turn find a place. So we can have a sense of macro authorship in which we invent a theory, you authorize a theory, you authorize a discursive field in which many books come into play, many books contribute by different authors, they contribute and consolidate the discursive field. In that sense, you could be a macro author, a different kind of an ontology of authorship is possible in that perspective. Now, these authors are in a position that I will call transdiscursive. Magnificent term if you look at it. Transdiscursive. It's a discursive quality which connects different discourses, right? So transdiscursivity is a term that I would want you to take from this particular essay. That is the author function that Foucault is pointing at. So that kind of author function which is more or less an umbrella term, something which oversees different other micro-author functions. The author of a particular discourse, the author of a particular ideology, the author of a particular discursive field, the author of a particular theorem in which different kinds of micro-authorships engage in. Okay, so that becomes an example of trans-discursive authorship, cutting across disciplines, cutting across different discourses. This is a recurring phenomenon, Foucault argues, certainly as old as our civilization. Homer, Aristotle, the Church Fathers, as well as the first mathematicians and the originators of the Hippocratic tradition all played this role. Furthermore, in the course of the 19th century, there appeared in Europe another, more uncommon kind of author, whom one should confuse with neither the great literary authors, nor the authors of religious texts, nor the founders of science. In a somewhat arbitrary way, we shall call those who belong to the last group as founders of discursivity. Okay, so he talks about another category of authors who emerge in 19th century in Europe, and we call those authors as founders of discursivity, right? And you can think of many kinds of discursivity in operation over here. So discursivity could be racism, discursivity can be politics, discursivity can be biopolitics, discursivity can be ideology, all kinds of discursivity. And we talk about authors who emerged in 19th century. Again, this is a very fertile period in a discursive sense, because there's a high point of imperialism, a high point of racism begins to happen at this point of time, begins to be systematized at this point of time, criminology begins to be systematized at this point of time. So different kinds of discourses are coming together. This is a high point of discourse formation, 19th century, as Foucault sees it. So unsurprisingly, we have several examples of individuals who might be classified, as Foucault does, as founders of discursivity. So another category of authorship is possible, and Foucault is examining that category in the following section. So I'll stop here. It's a very interesting point today, and we'll carry on and continue with this lecture, this particular section, in the next lecture. Thank you for your attention.